Hello, I'm Jonathan Geyer, managing editor of The Prospect, and today we're hosting a panel to launch our July-August issue. And one theme that comes across in this series of articles and reports that we've just put out is where progressivism is at today. We're 6 months into Biden taking office, and we're going to bring in some of our writers to ask sort of why has Biden had this acumen on some progressive issues domestically, others leaving by the wayside? Why has Biden been a relative progressive on a lot of national issues of concern, but on foreign policy, not that great? We're just going to kind of bring in some of our writers, Alexander Sammon, who's written in this issue how Biden defanged the left, Sarah Jaffe, who's with the Type Media Center, written a couple books on labor, including her most recent one, Work Won't Love You Back, and who profiles Nina Turner in our new issue, and Rozina Ali, also with the Type Media Center, who writes for New York Times Magazine and is working on a book on the war on terror, who thinks about 20 years since 9/11 in our new issue, what it all means, what are the stakes for Iraq and Afghanistan as Biden starts to withdraw. But I want to kind of start this conversation with Alex, whose headline, I'll just say again, because I think it's so great, How Biden Defanged the Left. I think in this story, Alex really gets to how Biden governs and the policy implications of what it means to have a Democratic administration that's navigating between these poles of maybe Joe Manchin and Justice Democrats. So Alex, can you kind of sum up for us, what's this story all about, and what do you think you're trying to say about how Biden engages or doesn't engage with the left?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for that introduction. Thanks for having me on this great panel. The thing that I think is interesting and that I thought was worth kind of reporting out and bearing out is the kind of evolving mentality we've seen towards President Biden from progressive groups in DC, and when we talk about the left in this particular instance, what I'm referring to are kind of institutional progressive groups within DC, which there are many various various specialties and concerns. In any case, when Biden got elected, we saw a lot of these groups, lavish him with praise as the next FDR, especially when we saw that first, the American Rescue Package get passed. It was, Biden is the most progressive president we've had in 80 years. Biden, worst case is LBJ, best case is even better. And what you didn't see was any real criticism. And as the administration has worn on, and Biden has shown that this, who he is and always has been, which is not a movement progressive. He's not someone who cares about these sorts of things. These groups have kind of been in a position where they need to protect the things that they care about. They need to advocate for them. They need to, put pressure on the president and the White House to make those things happen. And I think what we've seen is that there was a real lack of strategy about how best to do that. And so as kind of the summer has dragged on, and the infrastructure bill has gone pretty sideways in a lot of ways. And you've seen Biden negotiate down the number with himself. You've seen him leave things out that were huge priorities for progressive groups. You've seen him basically wave the white flag on voting rights. These are all things where, at a certain point, you would expect progressive groups to say, this is, here's a firm line. We are willing to criticize the president if he leaves this thing, which is the thing that we care most about, out of the agenda. And you still really haven't seen that. I mean, now there's a little bit of concern with folks, folks doing voting rights stuff. But where was that in May? Where was that in April? Where was that when this stuff was coming in? And so I think you're seeing there's a scramble in DC right now. Is how are these progressive groups going to apply pressure on the president? I mean, that's part of the job, and there really isn't a strategy and hasn't been one. And now that that kind of lavishing praise on Biden hasn't worked, the backup plan, that the stick behind the carrot hasn't appeared, and I think that's really important that we see kind of going through. This is going to be a fight. It's going to be an acrimonious one probably, and you don't want to be unwilling or unable to go there. And I think that's a crisis for progressive groups in DC right now, without getting too long-winded. But as we kind of see these battles set up through the rest of the year, how much.
So I want to bring in Sarah, because I think there's this proxy battle that she's written about in our new issue, which is Nina Turner running in Cleveland against a candidate who's been backed by Hillary Clinton and all these establishment politicians. Clearly, Nina Turner is, the squad's candidate, and in a way, it's a reflection of the same set of questions that Alex is writing about, which is how does the political mainstream deal with these two poles or these two forces? So, Sarah, we're not going to know the result of this election because it's literally happening right now, and our esteemed members and subscribers and friends of the Prospect will be watching this sometime in the not so distant future. But tell us, what are the stakes of this race?
Yeah. So one of the first things that Nina Turner said to me when I went to Cleveland to follow her around for a couple of days was, that she heard immediately on entering the race that there was an anybody but Nina push. And so I was there in early May. So all of this sort of energy, it was kind of funny. Dave Day and the Prospect's executive editor and I were just emailing back and forth after we finished the piece, like, oh, Hillary Clinton's endorsed Shontel Brown. Oh, Jim Clyburn's endorsed Shontel Brown. Like just things that we had to add to the story because they were obviously, sort of all of these big names are rolling in to endorse Shontel Brown, who is the establishment's candidate of choice. And rather notably for me as a Jewish reporter and connected to some of the things that I'm sure Rozina is going to talk about, Democratic majority for Israel's favorite candidate is Shontel Brown. And they have poured almost as much money the last time I checked as they did in trying to save Eliot Engel's seat. So that will lead into
Can you just tell our listeners for a minute, what is the Democratic majority for Israel? Why does it matter that they're going so hard after Nina Turner?
Yeah, not to step on the conversation that I'm sure you're going to have later, but one of the things that has happened with the so-called squad in Congress, right, is that Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Rashida, who is Palestinian, Ilhan Omar, who is, Somali and Muslim, they are criticized repeatedly for not going along with the party line on Israel. Nina Turner is, fairly mainstream, actually. Her position on Israel actually is no different than, say, Elizabeth Warren's, which is maybe we should put some conditions on the ridiculous amount of money that we send in aid to Israel. And so they poured money in some of these districts, trying to save some of these Democrats who were losing primary challenges. So as I said, Eliot Engel, who was defeated by Jamal Bowman, who is the one man in the squad, I guess, they spent $2 million trying unsuccessfully to save Eliot Engel's seat. They are putting this much money into Shontel Brown, who is a local elected official with, no reputation to speak of other than she is the one that the establishment has decided can beat Nina Turner.
And Rozina, you write in this issue kind of 20 years after 9/11, these forever wars are being winded down, but they're still not quite over. And we've had some authors on our site writing about how these wars are taking new forms, whether it's kind of over the horizon or drones or, all these new manifestations of the same old endless wars. Why do you think it is that Biden has been a relative progressive on domestic policy? And I say relative, I'm not saying he gets everything right. And we'll talk a bit about the eviction moratorium and infrastructure shortly. But why is Biden, somewhat progressive on domestic issues, but on foreign policy? What's your sense? Is he a cold warrior? Is there some kind of continuity between Democrats and Republicans here?
Yeah, definitely. I think ultimately what it comes down to is that there's no incentive to change foreign policy. For all the talk about divisions in DC, it's kind of incredible how much bipartisan support there has been for airstrikes, for the war on terror, for pretty consistent foreign policy over the past 2, even 3 decades. And, I think one of the main reasons for that is because it's pretty convenient to keep prolonging the war apparatus. As costly as it is, it's still proven to be financially lucrative for segments of the elite, for contractors and weapons making industries, for consultants and think tanks. And, unlike in Vietnam, when we had body bags coming home, we don't have that now. The conduct of war has changed. We largely conduct warfare through airstrikes and through proxies and through contractors more so than we do with ground troops, which means that the war tends to recede from the public attention. And I'm not sure how much of the public recognizes that Donald Trump claimed to be an anti-war president, but he increased airstrikes in Afghanistan and continued ground troops presence in Syria. And it's not surprising that essentially Biden is actually continuing to do the same. There really isn't any political or financial price to continue to be a war president. But I actually think it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next 4 years because of the tension between majority Democrats and progressives in the US, especially around questions of Israel and Palestine, and also because BDS is kind of moving into a more cultural war conversation rather than being a strictly foreign policy issue.
And your sense from, in this issue, you review Spencer Ackerman's new book, which takes a very strong, principled stance about how the failures of the war on terror extended well into the Obama administration and continued with Trump. You look at Samuel Moyn's book that's more of a historical, legal tome on kind of how these wars are conceptualized start to finish. I mean, where is the progressive vision for a foreign policy? Is, one thing I've noticed is only Ilhan Omar of the squad has a kind of foreign policy role in Congress. And maybe this is something that'll change over time. And maybe we have to think of national security more broadly than just armed services and foreign affairs. It's also, as we've learned in the pandemic, public health and finance and climate and immigration and, huge other buckets of policy. But, where are you hearing progressive voices on foreign policy, and what might they look like vis-a-vis the war on terror that's going to be turning 20 very soon?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think one of the big problems has been that there actually hasn't been a foreign policy vision on the left, a coherent one. We're seeing that sort of shift now. There have been more and more calls for an end to the war in Yemen, for example, an end to funding for Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And I think those are great because those are very targeted. But we still don't have a sense of what a progressive foreign policy looks like when it comes to matters of, uprisings around the country. Like what will happen if there's another Arab Spring next year? I don't think progressives know how to challenge that, how to actually navigate that. And for all its criticisms of U.S. support for these for these big henchmen like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, which is great, absolutely necessary, there has been less criticism of the war on terror itself, the very framework and premise of the war on terror. And ultimately, I was frankly kind of surprised that people were really raving about the fact that we had repealed the AUMF from 2002. Great step, but we still have AUMF 2001 on the books, which essentially allows the US to continue invading a country if it deems it's necessary for its national security. And I think those are areas that progressives still have a long way to go on that.
I mean, Sarah, how did this play out in the Nina Turner race as you were reporting on the ground? A huge amount of establishment money is being poured in for her, her contender, Shontel Brown. And, how did Nina Turner talk about foreign policy or Israel-Palestine, or was that just not among those issues that were brought up on the trail?
No, I think the point that Rozina made that BDS is becoming a culture war issue is really true, right? Nina Turner does not, she was a state senator in Ohio. She was a, Bernie Sanders surrogate, and Bernie sort of fell down on a lot of these issues as well, right? He also didn't know how to talk about any of these things. And so what was happening is essentially she's being called anti-Semitic for saying that there should be conditions on aid to Israel. They're calling her a BDS supporter, which in fact she's not. And it is just a way to say basically that she is too out of the mainstream, that she is somehow doesn't fit in. It's not actually in any way a substantive foreign policy debate, which would be nice if we had one of those. And so this is the way that all of these sort of issues, and I think this is really true across the board, is these things get racialized and they get sort of weaponized, not as actual issues that anybody wants to have a debate on, but just as a weapon to beat people with. So Ilhan Omar is just a problem because she is a Black woman with an accent and a head wrap that is talking about things that are deemed outside of the mainstream of American society, even though we've seen sort of over and over again that they're not actually that outside the mainstream at all. Jonathan, you look unfrozen now.
I look unfrozen. Sorry, I froze for a moment, but I guess I want to ask Alex kind of for the other side of this coin, which is, you say that, sometimes the left has been pretty successful though at pulling the establishment in its direction, or that, there have been some successes in terms of Justice Democrats or aligned groups at kind of pushing Biden to his full FDR potential, we might say. Can you talk us through a little bit of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that what's interesting is that for progressive groups, at least, pressure has worked. I mean, the Democratic Party, for all the things you can say about its sclerotic leadership, its refusal to kind of pass the torch to a non-octogenarian leadership group, its hangups on policy that date back to the 70s on a lot of things. Pressure does work. I mean, they are amenable to it in certain ways. And so I think one little thing that we've seen is on the annual refugee cap. So Biden indicated that he would raise the refugee limit off of its, Trumpian lows. And then he decided, with the great wisdom of many, Democratic senior officials, that this was too dangerous, too dicey optically for him, and then he would have to go back on that. And there was broad outcry from institutional progressive groups and activists and stuff, and then Biden caved. I mean, he did an about face. And was it bad optically? Of course not. Did his standing in the eyes of the Republican electorate change? No. So there's evidence that this works. It's just it's just not maybe very fun, and the sort of conflict diversion that's set in is not the sort of thing that's going to get results. And so, I mean, it's interesting because I think that both Rozina and Sarius are both saying really interesting points about how we've kind of in both foreign policy and in this special election, we see this reversion to this kind of these previous battles in the Democratic Party that rehashing the 2016 presidential primary, or kind of even going back 20, 30 years on foreign policy. And again, these are things that it's going to take some force to break out of them. It's going to take some pressure to break out of them. And we're stuck in these cycles because a lot of progressive groups have been unable or unwilling to produce the sort of pressure to get going in a different direction. And it's not easy to do that, but there is ample evidence that this does work and you can get results. Like, we're not mired in this way of thinking as on the left or in the Democratic Party forever. There have been, there has been progress that's been made.
Well, it's interesting to me because on the one hand, Biden has really said, we're going to, or at least on the campaign trail, really taking upon himself a progressive message, which is we're going to break down the barriers between foreign policy and domestic policy. And some of these, divisions are going to be broken down through what he's calling a foreign policy for the middle class, which, is maybe industrial policy, but then there's these huge contradictions within that, or an inability to really deal with the questions progressives are raising. And, you know, you were talking about optics, Alex. I mean, I think it's really interesting, Rozina, the optics of withdrawing from Afghanistan, you know, just before the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Is that a victory for the left, or is that a victory for the right in terms of a huge nick on Biden's reputation? Or, you know, also there's some, you know, withdrawals from Iraq, though not to the extent maybe some people would like. What do you see as the significance of these kind of withdrawals of troops this summer?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, you know, on the surface of it, it is kind of extraordinary that Biden has decided to pull out of Afghanistan and Iraq. But beyond the headlines, it's actually going to stay the same for the US, because we are going to continue US airstrikes in both countries. And we are going to continue presence of contractors, and we are going to continue using proxies in both countries, which have in the past committed gross human rights violations and further destabilized these places. I think what's most significant is what's going to change for Afghanistan now. You know, after 20 years of destabilizing this country, the fact that the US has pulled out so suddenly also means that the Taliban is essentially taking over. But I'm not, you know, in some respects, even that would mean a semblance of peace, but that's not what's going to happen. What's going to continue is this low-grade civil war between the Taliban and a US-backed Afghani government, because the US is still going to provide some modicum of support, which is terrible for Afghanis. It just means, you know, continuing warfare for them, even if it doesn't seem like it's continuing warfare for us. And, you know, leaving even Iraq and Afghanistan aside, in the past few months, the Biden administration has continued a $20 billion deal to the UAE to conduct airstrikes in Libya and Yemen and so forth. It is not sanctioning weapons deals to Saudi Arabia. It conducted airstrikes in Somalia. It has even decided to pivot towards China, a more adversarial approach towards China. And so, you know, whatever, like on the optics, sure, the forever wars that we know from our generations seem like they're drawing down, but actually war itself is not drawing down. It's expanding. Biden's Pentagon budget is larger than it was last year under Trump. So, you know, this is just more of the same, if not actually worse, if we are going to take a more adversarial approach to places like China and Iran even.
Do you, Sarah, see a kind of parallel between Biden not taking risks on canceling student debt, or not taking the big risk of having an eviction moratorium that's robust, and, you know, Cori Bush, squad member, congressperson, is, you know, sleeping outside Congress and protesting? Is there a parallel between that and kind of taking this also middle road on foreign policy, of kind of doing a couple things maybe to defang the left, to use Alex's terminology, but not to do the big withdrawal from forever wars? Or is that, maybe I'm going too far?
No. I think what we're seeing is like the centrism is still kind of dying, right? It still sort of has no answers. And it's funny, I'm talking to you right now from London, and I report here quite a bit these days, including some pieces for The Prospect. And it's interesting to me to have conversations sort of with people who are watching America from the outside about what's going on. And we're watching this sort of attempt to find the middle ground, but like, there's no political middle ground in the US anymore. You know, you've got a Republican Party that, you know, whatever percentage of it thinks that the election won from Trump, and wasn't today supposed to be the day that like something was going to happen and Trump would magically become president again. I can't even keep up with the conspiracy theories, but like, not to get too personal, but like my own mother believes that stuff. And then you've got an escalating climate crisis. You've got the Delta variant spreading across the country, even as people, in many states sort of lift all restrictions and say, go ahead it, kids. And we've got unending forever wars that, again, as Rozina said, we're just sort of drawing down in order to conduct them all like they're video games. And sorry if I sound angry at this, but like 11 million people are up for eviction. And the most dystopian headline that I saw today was that New Orleans was requiring all sheriff's deputies be vaccinated to prepare for the coming eviction push, which is just like, that's America 2021, and centrism is not going to cut it. And there are some really amazing things in the first stimulus package that Biden passed. I'm a real big fan of the child tax credit. Stuff like that is great. But the fact that the Democratic Party, to bring this back to what I'm on here to talk about, is going all out to squash Nina Turner in a Democratic safe seat, that they have no good argument for why they need Shontel Brown other than they can't let Bernie Sanders's like number one spokesperson get a seat in Congress because she might actually, perish the thought, demand that they do something and go join Cori Bush on those steps, is just like, it's absolutely infuriating to me. Millions of people are going to be evicted in the middle of a massive public health crisis. And the White House's response and the House leadership's response is shrug, vacation.
Alex, what does that mean in terms of how the Biden administration sees its own power? I mean, I just saw a tweet before we hopped on about, from a Justice Dems founder who said, has there ever been a political party in history that worked so hard to find excuses to not use its own power? Does that resonate for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty spot on. I think the eviction moratorium is another good case study in this situation where, the White House was aware of this, right? They were aware of what was an expiring eviction moratorium and what it meant. They have been aware of it for months. Both the House and the Senate have been aware of it. There's ample authority to do something about it. Nobody wants to be the one to do it. And I actually kind of feel bad finally for House leadership because the Biden administration basically, dumped it on them and said, like, this is your guys' problem. And it really is the Biden administration's problem. And they could fix it instantly if they were so inclined. But it shows you too, where were all these institutional groups on this? I mean, if we're looking at an eviction crisis with 8 million households likely to be evicted, the majority of those renters are non-white, and they're overwhelmed. They're largely female-led house. I mean, not largely, but you see a number of female-led households. A lot of this breaks down on gender lines in a very obvious way that we're, there's plenty of scholarship on. And so where are the major women's groups on this? Why wouldn't they issue a statement saying that the Biden administration must extend the eviction moratorium? I mean, we can talk about minority racial groups. Where are they on? I mean, these are groups with power in DC. They have lots of money and lots of funding, and the cost of them is really not that high to say, look, the administration has to do this. Like, we can't support a president who won't do this. And yet they kind of, in lockstep with the Biden administration, just maintain their silence. And then, here we are, and this thing, ends up blowing up because of a handful of members in the House who are willing to take a stand on it. And that's great. But those people haven't, I think that Cori Bush, what she's done is very commendable. And she hasn't been able to steer the agenda from the inside. I mean, it hasn't been how it's worked. And she's also a first-term, congressperson. You wouldn't expect that to be the case. But how DC works, you have various interest groups and stuff in lockstep, and how could the eviction moratorium have gotten to this point? Well, it gets to this point because people are afraid to criticize. The Biden administration would prefer not to do anything because it's easier for them, and they have financial incentives not to, and so now you have this thing where it ends up being a messaging loss for the it's a disaster optically for the White House. It's bad politics. It looks bad for the House and the Senate because they're all spread out. They have no idea what to do, and the average American is going to lose greatly on this, and there are going to be people who are going to suffer unnecessarily as the weeks wear on and the virus continues to spread. I mean, it's just a terrible situation and totally avoidable. And again, there's no deficit of authority from any group, whether that be the White House or any of these other groups, to do something here. It doesn't have to just be Cori Bush, and but thankfully someone, it could have not been Cori Bush. Cori Bush could not be in the House, and she could not be on the steps of the Capitol. So, not to say that it couldn't be worse. It's just to say that it's a good illustration of kind of where we're at.
Do you want to jump in, Sarah? Do you have more to say, or do you have a question for Alex? Or Alex, do you have a question for Sarah or Rozina?
I mean, I think it's such an important point, right? That like we saw this happen. I'm old enough to remember this happening in 2008, 2009, as Obama takes office. I'm old enough to remember that Andy Stern, who was then the head of the Service Employees International Union, was Obama's #1 White House guest for his first year in office. And what did we get for that? And by we, I mean working class people, not just SEIU, because I'm not a member of SEIU. But like what came from that was a mediocre health insurance reform bill. That is getting worse every year as bits of it get picked apart and the bills go up because it shockingly didn't contain costs. So like we got a little bit more from Biden than, okay, let's be fair. We got a lot more from Biden than we thought we were going to. I figured Biden would be worse than that first year of Obama. And so I know a lot of people in DC are people that I talk to anyway, are surprised by it, but like, it's so infuriating. And I don't know if you're losing your mind as much as I am, Alex, but like, it's just so infuriating to watch it happen again in worse conditions now.
Yeah, and I think that it's a really great point. I think what's infuriating too is that you had a bunch of people in the Democratic Party, especially in the Biden administration, say, we've learned our lessons from 2009. Like we admit finally that we blew that. We were not aggressive enough. We weren't ambitious enough. We're not going to make that same mistake again. We're not going to get played by an intransigent Republican minority. We're going to do the stuff. And then, of course, after 3 months, they seem to have gone through this collective forgetting where now we're back to that, where, at least it was a healthcare bill that time. Now it's an infrastructure bill, which is the most bipartisan thing in the world. It's like the least objectionable thing you can do in American government. And
other than raising the minimum wage, which they also can't accomplish.
Yeah, and it's going to take them 9 months to realize, or 6 months to realize that they're going to get 0 votes on it. I mean, it's just the thing that is dispiriting to me. Then on the other side is that you see these kind of progressive groups or labor groups. You mentioned SEIU, and they're obviously one of many, but they are also back in the same sort of framework that they were in 2009, where it was like, well, at least we're getting invited to the White House. Like we got to maintain our access, and we don't want to be too critical lest we lose this invitation. And it's like that didn't work for them then either. So we have kind of this, it's almost like a ritual amnesia where you have these progressive groups now doing the exact same sort of retrocession that the Biden administration is doing with all of its Obama employees and appointees and administration figureheads. And it's hard not to be discouraged about that. I mean, you would think that probably a lot of those people were going to be kind of cynically interested in doing what they did under Obama. You wouldn't really think that progressive groups would have also unlearned that lesson so quickly, but they seem to have. So, if things end up being better at the end of this session than they look now, it certainly won't be because there was a shift in approach or a willingness to flex the muscle that's out there. It will only have been finally, dumb luck or some other sort of act of God, because we really are kind of finding ourselves back where we were 12 years ago, and that isn't the best.
We don't have a ton more time, and I want to give you all a chance maybe to look around the corner and over the horizon a little and think about okay, we've had a half year of Biden. Obviously, we have to give some kind of space to the fact that there was an insurrection 2 weeks before he took office, and Trump was an anomaly and catastrophic on a number of policy fronts. So, keeping that in mind, what is your assessment, in a sentence on Biden 6 months in, each of you? And then, what do you kind of, I don't like predictions, but more like informed commentary on what you see around the bend in terms of whether it's the eviction moratorium or the big infrastructure bill, or kind of the war on terror, 2001 till unknown end date. what do you see based on what we've seen so far in the last 6 months of Biden? Do one of you guys want to start, or you guys need some contemplation first? Go ahead.
Yeah, I can start. Just summarizing the last 6 months regarding foreign policy, more of the same. But I realize that I've been, I don't want to be so pessimistic about what's going to come up on the horizon. I do think it's significant that we have as many progressives as we do in Congress. I think it is significant that we have a grassroots movements across the country that do seem larger and more vocal and, actually to me a bit more strategic than they were in 2008, 2009. And I think it's significant that we see people like AOC and Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and making connections between foreign policy and domestic policy, and recognizing that $750 billion spent on the Pentagon could actually go back to communities, or could fund infrastructure, or could fund housing. And I think that's significant. I think that is going to be places where we might actually see some movement.
Sarah or Alex, which one of you wants to jump in? Sarah, go for it.
My one word assessment of Biden is meh. But I think, like Rozina said, we have bigger, stronger, smarter grassroots movements. And they are not in DC because they're not interested in being in DC, because they know that that's actually not where power happens. And so when we look at Cori Bush, right, who is sleeping on the White House steps, which is a tactic, like we're about to be 10-year anniversary of Occupy Wall Street. Anybody else seeing the reference, right? Cori Bush came to her political prominence in St. Louis through the Ferguson protests. She was out there every night. And when she gave her speech about Palestine on the floor of the House, she linked it to Bassem, who was a St. Louis Palestinian who was in the protests with them every day. And so the way that all comes together in somebody like Cori Bush being in Congress and somebody like Nina Turner maybe being in Congress is that these aren't just identity issues, even though people will try to weaponize them as such, but they are actually things that they connect the dots in a way that can be really meaningful in bringing a conversation about American military influence in the world back to the conversation about why the heck are 11 million people about to be evicted, and what is the connection between policing at home and policing abroad and policing by drone strike, which we're going to keep doing. Because all of these are actually things that we have to figure out answers for and ways to talk about very soon, because again, the clock is ticking on this stuff. It's not just, pie in the sky. It's really necessary to get this right.
So some optimism, some pessimism. Where do you come out, Alex?
Well, I think that, I think both of you guys are right on. I would just say that there's a lack of urgency and on everything. And it's not as bad as it could be. Definitely not. I kind of want to add to the chorus of not total pessimism here. I think that, in the Obama years, Obama, was actively working against, the grassroots movement, actively working against these kind of progressive forces. And used access to the White House to do that. In the Clinton years, even Barbara Ehrenreich wrote about this famously, how the activist forces were basically undone via various visits to the Clinton White House. This isn't new, and I think the lack of urgency we've seen from Biden on a lot of stuff is also true of his his orientation towards the grassroots. I mean, he's not a movement president. He's not as actively invested in undercutting movement stuff as some of his predecessors. So, I just think that it's not a very big window, right? It's not like there's time for a lot of this stuff to get resolved. And in any sort of term, you'd expect them to get two big packages. I mean, anything more than that, you get Dodd-Frank and you get the ACA. You get, you're going to get two things. And I just don't see, there are a lot of things that need to be dealt with, and a lot of them are going to take a lot of doing, and I don't see that. And I think it would be nice if Democrats broadly had the same degree of urgency, or felt the same degree of urgency that they use in their fundraising pitches, because I think for a lot of people in this country that urgency is very real.
Well, there you have our July-August issue come to life. Subscribe to get our latest package of essays and reports. Rozina Ali writing about the war on terrorism, Sarah Jaffe on the meaning of Nina Turner's run, and Alex Sammon, our staff writer, on how Biden defamed the left. Everything's available online. Everything's free, thanks to our readers, members, and supporters. We're really grateful. I also want to thank our PR director, Anna Greisbord, who's hiding behind the icon there and put this all together. And we're so thankful that you joined us. So come back to prospect.org for more coverage of what the Biden presidency and the movement will mean for the next 6 months and the next 3.5 years and beyond. So thanks a lot.